This podcast episode is brought to you in association with Serve and Protect Credit Union. Serve and Protect are there to help employees of the Prison and Probation Service to save and there if they need to borrow. Find out how they can help you at serveandprotectcu.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the podcast of the Prison Officers Association, the UK's largest professional union for prison, correctional and secure psychiatric workers with over 30,000 members. Each month we'll be looking at a different area of the union's work. In this episode, we demystify and make clear the whole issue of pensions. Whether you're in or affected by the Alpha scheme, the new 2022 scheme, the impact of the McCloud ruling on discrimination, or Payment Plus, the General Secretary, senior officers and pensions legal expert Ivan Walker set out what the union is doing to defend members' interests. We're here to talk about pensions and the prison service and what the members of the POA can expect when they get to pensionable age, but it's an issue that does have a history and has lots of aspects. We've got a great set of guests here. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves before we delve into the subject. So, Steve, if you'd like to start off.
I'm Steve Gillen, General Secretary of the POA. I've been General Secretary since the year 2010. This is my third period of office.
And Joe?
I'm Joe Simpson. I'm the Deputy General Secretary. I've only been in the post now for 2.5 years, and Steve gave me pensions as part of my portfolio.
And Andy?
Andy Baxter. I'm full-time official for the POA. Been full-time official around about 18 months. Tend to step in and step out and assist Joe as best I can.
And last but by no means least, Ivan.
Morning, I'm Ivan Walker. I'm a pension solicitor working with the POA, specialised in pensions since 1987. I've been fighting this case ever since the coalition government came in 2010 and started this whole shenanigan.
Well, gents, you're all very welcome indeed to the podcast. I mean, pensions can be, an intimidatingly complex issue, but I think one of the things we're all here to do today is to try and strip away the jargon and make it as accessible as possible to the members who are listening. But no issue has no history, as it were. So, Steve, could you possibly outline the history of pensions as far as the POA is concerned and what the major contributors to the current set of circumstances are?
Well, I suppose the main issue goes back as far as 2007, in actual fact, and that was when all the civil service unions and public sector came to an agreement that was supposed to give lifetime protection. So anybody starting after the 1st of July 2007 went into a career average scheme with a retirement age of 65 who were joining any public sector such as the civil service, including the prison service. And that was to preserve what was in place for everybody on different schemes at that time. So in actual fact, those who had the right to continue to retire at 55 and 60, that was observed. The reality is, when the coalition came in 2010, they effectively ripped that up. And I think our members were very aggrieved by that, by the outcome, by what they had always believed was a lifetime protection on the pensions. But when we took legal advice at the time, when the Francis Maud administration was leading on that particular issue, the legal advice was pretty clear in actual fact, and much to our dismay, was that there's no such thing as lifetime protection. It only lasts for the lifetime of that parliament. So we were in real trouble in respect to that. And that's effectively the history of it. People believed that they had that lifetime protection going forward from 2007, and that was ripped up effectively. And people do feel aggrieved by that.
So, Ivan, we have this historical setting, historical background, where people already are feeling that they're being denied something that they had an entitlement to. And then we get the McCloud judgment. So what's the history of the McCloud case, and what does it mean in practice?
Well, as Steve said, when the government came forward with its proposals in 2010, on the face of it, they were simply going to rip up one pension scheme and impose a new one on everybody else, on everybody. During the course of negotiations with the unions, though, the government agreed to introduce a transitional arrangement so that people who were closer to retirement age either wouldn't have to go into the new pension scheme Alpha or would go in a little bit later. Now, where the government went wrong is that that transitional arrangement discriminates on the grounds of age. The reason why you're allowed to stay in the old pension scheme was simply a function of how old you are. So they set up an arrangement which discriminates against younger members, and that's against the law. The case was initially brought by about 200 judges, including 6 High Court judges, which was interesting. That was followed by a claim by the Fire Brigades Union, and then followed by claims from the Defence Police Federation and from the POA, all alleging that these transitional arrangements discriminated against younger members unlawfully. And in 2018, the Court of Appeal said, yes, it does. Now, the thing about the way discrimination law works is, I think self-evidently, if something discriminates, you've got to change things so that everybody's treated in the same way. But what the law says is if you're going to eliminate the discrimination, you can't do that by pushing the favoured class of people down to the level of the disadvantaged class. So it's levelling up. Everybody's got to be taken up to the level of the advantaged class, which means that all of the people who transferred to Alpha or who were due to transfer to Alpha were entitled to be treated as if they'd never left their old pension scheme. And the Employment Tribunal in the prison officer cases has now made a declaration that's exactly what the state of play is. Everybody should be, everybody who was in the scheme on the 31st of March 2012 should be allowed to transfer back to the old pension scheme if it's in their interests to do so. I should emphasise that point, that it's members who were in the scheme on the 31st of March 2012. The reason for that is that anybody who joined the service on or after the 1st of April 2012, all of those people went into Alpha, regardless of their age. So those people, anybody who joined 1st of April 2012 or later, I'm afraid there's no question of discrimination because everybody was treated in exactly the same way.
So it's important to note that if people could transfer back, if it was advantageous for them to do so, and for some people it wouldn't be advantageous, so they should stay where they are. But if that remedy has been identified and ruled upon, has it actually been implemented, or have there been delays?
It hasn't been implemented. There have been delays. And the reason is that the Cabinet Office and Civil Service Pensions, they said it's all too difficult. I think it's fair to say that they're dealing with, because this is applying across all of the public service pension schemes, there are huge numbers of people who are involved. I think they said there's something like 3 million people who are affected by this. Now, for most people, a delay is not actually going to make a difference because you're paying the same contributions as before. You will be put into, if it suits you, put back in the old civil service pension scheme from October 2023 at the latest. I'm going to come back to this question of the dates in a minute. But unless you're going to retire before October 2023, it doesn't really make a difference to you which scheme you're in the meanwhile. The people who are suffering are the people who have already retired or should have been allowed to retire under the terms of the civil service pension scheme, the old scheme. And they're simply being told it's too difficult, too complicated. We will get round to sorting out your case, but we're not making any promises to do so before October 2023. And that's simply not good enough. What the tribunal has said is that these people are entitled to be members of the old civil service scheme. You do not need to change the law, the regulations. You do not need to change the legislation. That is just automatic. You have that right to be treated as a member of the old scheme. So arguments from the government that we need legislation, even they know that that's wrong. Arguments from the government to say that the tax implications make it all too difficult, well, that again is simply wrong. There is tax complication. We all know that. But if there is any extra tax to pay, well, the government's going to have to pay it. But we've got to get the government to actually do something about this. Now, the way that we're going to do that is we're going to start a new test case. It doesn't need to be more than for a small handful or possibly even one person, saying, you're not treating me properly. I have retired. You have retired me under the terms of the wrong scheme. And I want you to pay me damages, compensation for not treating me as if I'm a member of the old scheme. That case is bound to succeed. And I think the government knows that. The Fire Brigades Union has just issued a claim to deal with that point. The POA are going to do so shortly, with a view to taking it to court, getting what's called a summary judgment, in other words, without having to wait for the usual drawn-out court process, and get the government to accept that people who have already retired should be treated on old pension scheme terms if it is in their interests to do so. The government knows that, frankly. They're just saying it's too difficult.
Well, thank you very much for that. I imagine anyone listening to this who's not really familiar with this issue will first of all be very grateful for a very clear explanation. Thank you so much, for that. But also will be outraged at the fact that people now years past their pensionable age have still not received a fair, just pension to which they are absolutely entitled. I mean, I don't want to be over dramatic, but some POA members will have died in unnecessary financial distress because of this mistake.
If I could, please, and it's something that Ivan touched on, and that's our members who've retired, especially those members who've been retired who were in Classic, who've been retired between 2015 and now. Part of that scheme is if they are retired under Classic, the rules for that, for want of a better word, is that they are no longer fit to carry out the duties of the rank that they're in until normal pension age. And a lot of our members who were in Classic would see their pension increased by a further 6 2/3 years. So there were people who retired in 2015 who were missing out on roughly round about £2,500 per annum pension, which is a lot of money. It's just to say on this podcast, we are still pressing Cabinet Office to get that sorted out for you. And I can honestly say this, the frustration that myself and Ivan have got over this, for them to do the right thing and give our members pension justice after all these years and allow them to go and retire in dignity. And they're still, and it's just, for me, a further problem that's exacerbating some of our members' mental health as well, because a lot of our members have retired because of PTSD and mental health issues when they've been badly assaulted. So they will be one of the first set of people who Cabinet Office will go and rectify pensions for.
And this is not the only issue, is it?
Yeah.
I mean, Joe, I understand that there's a thing called the cost cap surplus challenge, and I wondered how that blends in with the situation that Ivan's described.
The cost cap challenge is a ceiling and a floor, for want of a better word, when the government are taking contributions. And if the contributions breach the ceiling, it means there's not enough contributions going into the pension scheme to pay out pensions. So that means they have to address that very quickly. They can do that through reducing any benefits in the pension scheme. I think this government, because they're so hell-bent on doing things, would immediately go for increasing contributions. But when they'd done the first set of assumptions after Alpha had come in, they realised that the floor had been breached. And that means that there's too much money going into the pension scheme. So they need to address that. Because I sit on the scheme advisory board for the POA, the scheme advisory board for the civil service pensions wrote to the minister with a remedy over the next 4 years, which was from 2020 up to 2024. And what that would mean is that what we said was reduce the contributions by 2%. So our members would have been paying 3.6 instead of 5.6. Increase in the death benefit. So instead of 2 years, it'd be 3 years. So that's what they were going to do to address it. And then they got the McCloud judgment to say that you were wrong in what you've done. You've discriminated against members of the civil service pension scheme, in particular our members, and that needs to be rectified. Government then looked at it and decided that they were going to do nothing about the floor breach, because what they decided to do was all of the money that was in the pension scheme that was being overpaid by members, they were going to use that to bail them out of the financial detriment that government would be in because of their discriminatory behaviour. And Liz Truss, if I remember rightly off the top of my head, came up with a figure of £4 billion. We immediately got in contact with Ivan, and he agreed with the POA and the other civil service unions that that was absolutely disgraceful. We were still waiting for government to make that decision, what they're going to do, because so then we can then start court proceedings in order to fight them on that. In effect, what they're saying is that we've made a mistake and you're going to pay for it. And to be quite honest, they've broke the law, and they now want civil service pension members to pay for that mistake. And we're saying that is absolutely not on.
Ivan, in legal terms, what could be the remedy to this particular part of the problem?
Can I just come in on something that Joe said? He said that the cost had been estimated at 4 billion. The original estimate was it was 4 billion for each year that they didn't rectify it. In other words, it wasn't 4 billion in one go. It was each and every year until they changed the scheme again would cost the government £4 billion. They later said that when they said we're going to make these changes, they estimated the total bill would come to 17 billion. How they managed to lose 5 billion along the way is something best known to them rather than to us. But that's the price tag that we're talking about. How do we challenge it? Well, I think first off to understand that anybody who's in the old civil service pension scheme isn't being affected by this attempt to claw back the cost. What we're talking about is the way that they're going to try and play around with the rules of Alpha to get their 17 billion back. We actually started the court proceedings last year when the government said that it was still just thinking about it. And we said, there's nothing to be thought about. You've broken the floor that Joe was describing. The scheme had turned out to be cheaper than you thought. So you just got to do it. Government said it was thinking about it. So with our agreement, the court said, we'll put the proceedings on hold until the government's had a good chance to think. We now know that the government is going to try to make us pick up the 17 billion price tag. And we said, you're not doing that. We're waiting for the government to publish the detail of its proposals, which is meant to be in the summer. And then we'll start the court proceedings again. The legal theory behind it is, you could say it's really simple. It's simply not fair. You could also say, and this is in fact the legal basis of the argument, is to say this cost ceiling and floor process was designed to make sure that the scheme was affordable. The Alpha scheme was affordable. In fact, you're using it for a completely ulterior purpose, for a different purpose. You're trying to use it to claw back your money. And that's just not what the legislation is there designed to do. So we'll kick these proceedings off again sometime late summer once we've got the government's detail.
Right. Thank you very much.
If I could just come in on one point, the discussion we've had so far is on the basis that the old schemes are better than alpha. In some cases, alpha is better than the old schemes. Two issues in particular. In the classic scheme, if you die and you're survived by a partner, your partner will get a pension, but only if you're legally married to each other. In alpha, your partner will get a pension whether or not you're married. And second, in some cases, if you retire early on the grounds of ill health, the uplift you get to your pension can be better in alpha than it is in classic. Now, if you're an older member who's still in the legacy scheme, you might say to yourself, well, actually, I'd like to be an alpha. The way this discrimination law works is that if you're older and you've been denied the opportunity to get into alpha, you've been discriminated against on the grounds of age as well. So it cuts both ways. What that means, and this is the important point, is that when the changes are made, everybody who's in service between 2012 and 2022 is going to be given a choice. You can either have your legacy scheme terms or you can have alpha terms, whichever is the better for you. So we're keeping an eye on the older people too, is the point I'm making.
Andy, I understand as well that there's a new Reform 2022 pension scheme that preparations are being made for. So what is due to happen next year, and what are the concerns and challenges that the union will have about that?
Yes, it's been confirmed that the scheme going forward from April 22 will be the Alpha scheme. There were some concerns that this could be used as an opportunity to reduce pension benefits or further increase pension costs, but it will be the Alpha scheme that goes forward. Obviously, that's disappointing for us because after April 2022, we will see the majority of our members in a pension scheme where they can't access benefits without a reduction until they're 68. I think it's important to say that the benefits accrued in the legacy schemes prior to 2022 will remain linked to final salary at the point of retirement, and they retain the original normal retirement age. However, the pension accrued from 2022 will be linked to state retirement age. We have to remember, as Ivan pointed out, the Alpha scheme accrual is more generous than the former legacy schemes, so there is a potential to reduce the impact of retiring earlier due to the scheme being more generous. The government have confirmed that members will be given a choice in relation to which scheme they want their 2015 to 2022 service to be based upon. That decision will be made when the member puts their pension into play.
So, I mean, this is an already busy agenda with the McCloud remedy pending, the cost cap surplus challenge being litigated, a new scheme in the offing, and on top of all that, the POA has a challenge to make Payment Plus pensionable. I mean, Steve, Joe, I wonder if you could tell us about, first of all, what is Payment Plus for those who don't know, and secondly, why you believe it needs to be made pensionable, and finally, what arguments are there against it and who's making them?
Payment Plus is what's described by the employer as an allowance, and it is basically brought in for work that wasn't profiled work, i.e., it wasn't work, it was work outside of what the prison service got for running a prison, for like going out on hospital bed watches, doing constant watches, which is actually sitting outside of a cell to watch a prisoner who is a danger to themselves. But it's morphed from that into where it's now being used for normal day-to-day prison officer duties. So if somebody is missing off the details, say you're meant to have 32 staff and you've only got 30, then those hours would be paid as Payment Plus. That's what they're doing. So what we are saying now is, well, it's not an allowance. What it is basically is overtime, and it should be pensionable. Myself and Steve discussed this with Ivan quite some time back, but because of McCloud and because of the cost cap remedy and things, it took a bit of a back seat, really, and we're now looking at challenging the prison service on that, because both myself and Andy have actually asked Cabinet Office if the prison service had gone to them, saying to them, look, we're about to pay this, will it be pensionable, which they're supposed to do under the scheme rules. According to Cabinet Office, they cannot remember any approach by the employer to do this. So Andy, on the instructions of Steve, wrote to Cabinet Office and said, we want you to look at this and look at it being made pensionable, which they found quite curious because it's not often the trade union that goes and asks for something to be made pensionable when it's the employer who's paying. So it's a little bit backward in the way that we've done it, but we've put Cabinet Office on notice that this is what we want. And when we approached Ivan says, quite simple, we'll write to them before a letter before action and turn around and say, look, this is a payment that you're making and it should be pensionable and we want it made pensionable. So that's basically where that comes from.
I mean, you know, part of me would love to be a fly on the wall of the office of either the Home Office or the Treasury or both when they have the discussion with the prison service about the need for them to make this pensionable. Ivan, again, in legal terms, would you see this as a quite straightforward matter, or is it something that is beset with problems?
It's going to be a question not of asking the government nicely, but reading the rules of the scheme. The schemes, bearing in mind we got 3-4 different schemes now, and under the rules of the schemes, asking, is this actually within the definition of pensionable pay? Now, there was a court case a couple of years back brought by a court clerk who was working regular weekend overtime, and he said, I think that this overtime should be pensionable. And what the court said is, if this is part of your normal working hours, doesn't matter if it's labelled overtime or not, doesn't mean if you're getting an overtime rate of pay for it or not. If this is your ordinary duties, then the pay that you get for those performing those ordinary duties is pensionable. Now, that sounds like Payment Plus to me. So I think that under the rules of the scheme as they stand at the moment, whether or not the government likes it, Payment Plus is pensionable.
Thank you. There are clearly lots of elements in this debate, and the union clearly has a very full agenda when it comes to negotiating fair and just pensions. Steve, what is the next stage of the campaign, and how can members and reps get involved or more involved?
I think we've got to sort out the legal issues and separate them from the campaign issues, because I've always believed the POA have been very, very consistent going back to 2010 when the coalition government first said that they were going to rip up all the agreements in the public sector. If you remember, they played out that big scenario, didn't they, during the austerity years, the public sector. And they ran a good campaign through the right-wing media, as I call it, like the Mail and the Sun and so forth, about public sector workers having gold-plated pensions. And it was effectively not bringing people up to our level, but it was actually a race to the bottom. And rather than saying gold-plated pensions, what they forgot was that it was actually a case of deferred pay. That's what pensions are, indeed. But they won the narrative, because when I used to go to different forums and even in amongst friends and different things outside the public sector, people used to say, well, you're all right. You all get decent pensions, whereas us in the private sector don't. And they made it worker against worker, in effect. And they sort of won that narrative. But where I think we've always been consistent as a trade union, even when, this isn't a criticism of other unions in the public sector, during those tense times where industrial action, up to including strike action, was taken in relation to the pensions changes, some unions then recommended it to their members as the best it could be achieved in the circumstances. The POA never did that. Even when we were offered a deal by Francis Maud that 50% of it was funded by government and then we paid the rest, our members rejected that in a postal ballot back in 2012. And we continue to say that the retirement age, it's the policy of the union, that the retirement age for unified grades, prison officers, and operational support grades should be 60. That's slightly different from the legal challenges, and I think some of our members get confused. They think if we are successful in all the legal challenges, then the government are just going to say, yes, we'll put you back. You've got the right to retire at 60. They're not going to do that. And that's where our campaign needs to continue to break the link between retirement and the state pension age. Because if we don't break that link, bearing in mind the Conservatives have got an 80-seat majority, then they could, in effect, because of what we've seen in the pandemic and God knows what, they could then make the case that the state pension age is then increased to 70 years of age. And thus, then retirement age and pension age for prison officers and also operational support grades then goes up to 70. And that's why I think our strategy from our National Executive Committee needs to be clearly outlined now to ministers, which we do on a regular basis, to try and break that link between the state pension and retirement age. And we've got our work cut out, but we need to step up that campaign. And that's where our members come in and branches, so that they are fully focused on our campaign. And by entering into that campaign together, no matter who their MPs are, across the spectrum, it doesn't matter whether it's Conservatives, Lib Dems, Scottish National Party, DUP, Sinn Féin, whoever, Labour, we've got to get in their faces and explain the rationale as why prison officers cannot work to the age of 68 and it's dangerous and so forth. But more than that, I think we've got to say, in actual fact, that we were treated badly going back to the days of Lord Hutton when he made his recommendations. And I'd never want to align prison staff with firefighters or police officers or the armed services, because we've got our own arguments. And when I go around some of our branches and they say, we want to be treated like firefighters and police officers in our retirement age, I say, well, we could have got you that yesterday. But what it would have meant was that you were paying exactly the same as what firefighters were in the superannuation schemes and also police officers, which is far higher than they're paying. So we don't really want to get involved in that discussion, actually. We actually want to get it for nothing, if I'm truthful. We want the government to say that's the scheme. Bearing in mind, we only make up 3% of the civil service scheme. I think the arguments are there about the injuries to prison officers, the sort of workplace that we work in, and I'm not saying we're unique, because every public sector workforce has its own challenges. But historically, we know the issues pertaining to the pressures that operational support grades, prison officers, and unified grades face. And we won't rest. We've been consistent since 2010 going forward. We've rejected every scheme going. We want a retirement age of 60, and we'll continue to campaign that. But first and foremost, I think the trick is to break that link between the state pension age and retirement age for prison officer grades.
So the message is clear. The union can and does make a real difference to the working lives of prison officers, wherever they work and whoever they work for. So if you haven't signed up yet, speak to your local POA rep or head over to poauk.org.uk to find out how to join and all the information about the union and the work that it does. Thank you for listening to the POA podcast. We hope you like what you've heard and will join us for the next edition. Until then, thank you and goodbye. The POA podcast is presented by me, Simon Sapper. Music is by Scott Holmes. This podcast episode has been brought to you in association with Serve and Protect Credit Union. Whether you're saving for tomorrow or borrowing for today, Serve and Protect are here to make life easier with repayments taken straight from your pay. Learn more at serveandprotectcu.co.uk.